Malaysian, but we're starting. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lynn. This is Sharmila. Hello. And together we host By the Book, which is a book show on BFM 89.9. We interview authors like Twan. We highlight bookstores. We talk about books in general. So I'm very excited to be here with everybody to do exactly that. So, of course, we're going to talk about the House of Doors, but it's not going to be all our questions today. Just to let you know that we will be handing the mic over to you very early to ask your questions. So, if you'd like to let those thoughts marinate, please do, and soon we'll open up the floor.
So before we get running to talk about the House of Doors, which is what we're all here today to ask questions about and to talk about, a little bit about Twan himself, if you didn't know already. He's of course Malaysian, born in Penang, spent some of his childhood there and then moved to KL. He currently lives in Cape Town. He is by training and by profession in a previous life a lawyer, but now a writer, and of course a multi-award winning nominated writer as well. He very recently was longlisted for the Booker Prize for the third time for the House of Doors. Previously, not the first time, because all three of his novels have actually been honored by the Booker Prize previously. He's also a winner of the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction for Garden of the Evening Mist. So his latest novel, The House of Doors, which has just come out, very interesting one, historical fiction, but also draws on some real-life characters. I think it's best to hear about the book from the man himself, so I'm going to get Twan to sort of give us a snapshot of what the novel is about.
Afternoon, thank you. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's really good to be back in KL after 3 years away because of whatever happened to me. The House of Doors is my third novel, and it's about Somerset Maugham who visits Penang in the 1920s, and he gets to hear about a few stories which eventually leads him to write one of his most well-known stories called A Letter. It's also about Leslie Hamlin, this unhappy housewife living in Penang in 1910 and 1921. And it includes appearances by Dr. Sun Yat-sen as well, who was in Penang in 1910 to fundraise for his revolution, which he wanted to bring down the Chinese monarchy and replace it with a republic government.
So Lynn and I were quite lucky to be able to speak to Twan on our show. So we've both read The House of Doors. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you have read the book already? All right, so we'll try not to spoil the plot for you. But for the rest of you who haven't, you are in for quite a treat because so we thought we'd share some of our impressions of the book before we went into questions. So for me, primarily, actually, I didn't know what I was getting into when I got into the novel. I didn't know, for instance, that it would be about Somerset Maugham. And then I didn't expect that it would actually intersperse so many actual living characters. Now, I, in particular, was very taken with the Sun Yat-sen connection. I also really enjoyed the Ethel Proudlock trial, which I didn't know very much about at all. And I loved how the shifting perspectives actually come together to form this cohesive story.
So I love Somerset Maugham, so I was extremely excited to know that he was going to be a character in this book. And I think what the main thing that I took away from it in impression of reading the novel was this real sense memory of being in Malaya and in Penang at a very specific moment in time, of being able to smell the wind, taste food, be on the beach, and to have that sort of setting be such an evocative one for the historical stories that form such a big part of the novel was a really fun part of the book for me. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that those of you who've read the book will have a sense of what we're talking about as well.
So food is, I think, real. I loved reading the descriptions of the various Penang delicacies. I also felt like, being from Malaysia myself, it's really nice, and I'm sure most of you will agree with us that it's really nice to read a book and you feel like you can almost recognize the spaces that are being written about. You can imagine yourself walking down the same streets. And then there's that layer of it being historical. So it's a Penang of the past. And so you may recognize the names of certain roads or you may recognize certain buildings, but it's also not how it is now. And us being from this part of the world, it's not often, I think, that we get fiction that does that for us. It feels simultaneously personal, but also telling a larger story. And that part, I think, for me, was quite special to read about.
So I think that leads us to our first question, actually, because Twan Ing, this book is set so heavily in a very specific moment in Malayan history, and you do seem to have a fascination with the Malaya of the past. What draws you to writing these sorts of stories and to, drawing inspiration from them?
Well, it's I've always been fascinated by history and in particular Malaysian history. So with my first two novels, I set them in before and during and after the Japanese occupation. So with this one, I felt I'd better stop writing about the Japanese occupation because people were getting tired of it. So I decided to go even further back in time. And the genesis of the story was actually a letter. I first read the letter when I was in my late teens. Loved it, found it very interesting and fascinating. But what intrigued me even more was when I discovered that Mom had based the letter on a real-life murder trial which had taken in Kuala Lumpur in 1910, and which nobody seemed to know much about. That was highly fascinating to me. So I started thinking of how do I write about this story a bit more. And for many years, I couldn't think of a way to do that. The other thing I wanted to write about was also about Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Again, I found it very colorful because here was this man who had brought down this 2,000-year-old monarchy, and he had started all that. He had planned it in this little shop house in this little street in Penang, and which again a lot of people seem to have forgotten about or ignored. To bring these two together, I couldn't think of any way. It was only when I started really working on it and I thought, let's have somebody tell Somerset Maugham or certain stories in Malaya, and then I saw that I could bring all these elements together.
I remember during our interview, you made reference to how your dad used to talk about Sun Yat-sen in Penang.
Oh yes, my father grew up in one of the shop houses in Armenian Street in the 50s. And when I was small, he often mentioned Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Dr. Sun Yat-sen lived in this street, Dr. Sun Yat-sen this and that. I had no idea who he was then, and I always thought he was just some Chinese sincere practicing TCM up the road. It was only much later when I went to school, and then I heard, this was this incredibly important figure. And he had actually been in Armenian Street, and his HQ was there. And again, so many of my contemporaries seemed oblivious, not oblivious, but I don't think they were much impressed by the whole idea of it. So, and I felt that it's quite a shame to let that slip away.
So we know about your fascination with the Japanese occupation. And not to give too much away, but are there other points or aspects of Malaysian history that you are interested in, that you'd like to explore in future works?
So I mentioned recently that this will probably be the last story I'll set in Malaysia for quite a long while, because I think it's time to move on and give you all a rest from all this. So in many ways, this is sort of like the final chapter in my Malayan trilogy, as it were. And that's why there are some characters in this book where they have links with The Gift of Rain. I brought some of the characters back again as a sort of a farewell to this part of the world, which is quite sad in a way, I think. But you never know. If a story comes to me again, which has to be set in Malaysia, then there's no rules.
So the Gift of Rain was published in 2007, Garden of Evening Mists 2011, House of Doors now 2023. Through that more than a decade. Has your writing process changed a lot? You know, have you developed the way in which you write a novel?
It hasn't, the process hasn't changed, and in fact, it's gotten more and more difficult with every book. When I published The Gift of Rain, an experienced author from the UK said, "Oh, the first book is always the hardest. You find that it gets easier with each subsequent book." And of course, he was lying. I found it gets harder. The Garden of Evening Mist took a lot out of me to write, and this one was even worse. This was incredibly hard to make it work, to bring all the elements together and to make them cohere and make sense. So I think it's unfortunately for me, it gets harder and harder, and also because with each book I try to push myself and improve as a writer. So you notice that the style has been changing with each book. It's become more pared back, I think less rich. Also because, well, it gets harder and harder to think up of pretty descriptions, you know. It's so hard to come up with something that's original and poetic and yet still hits you right here. So with each book, they're going to get thinner and thinner and thinner.
So I find that really interesting because as the styling pairs back, the research is so heavy. You referenced Apple Proudlocks and Yatsen. There's a lot of research that goes into this. So if I could just extend that a bit, right? As you're working to kind of refine your style, how does the research part of it factor in when you have such a wealth of research and you're cramming that in?
It's, I really have to work very hard to incorporate what I found out, my research into the book without bogging the narrative down, without making it look like an info dump, as the Americans call it. It's very hard, and I think most of the time in this book I don't really explain much. I just mention it in passing, and I leave it to the reader to either infer or make the effort to find out for themselves, which I think is good in a way because it makes the reading experience more interactive. The reader has to engage more of themselves instead of just being a passive recipient of information. They now have to start thinking and trying to put the pieces together as well. That's one of the plus points of the book.
I want to talk about your pretty descriptions because you're known for having this sort of lyrical way of describing things, a sort of a way with words, I think, that's come to be very recognizably your style. Is that something that you had to work on to develop? Is that just how you think?
Well, I start with the visual image in my head, so I have to transcribe what I see onto the page, and not just what I see, but what I feel and what I sense. So to do that, you really have to push the limits of language to almost the maximum without stressing the language until it becomes hard to digest or hard to accept. It's incredibly time-consuming to come up with metaphors or similes that are beautiful, but yet when you read it, you say to yourself, yes, that's exactly what this looks like, but why hasn't anybody seen it that way? For example, in Garden of Evening Mist, I came up with a description of a spider web in the breeze, and I said the spider web sieving for insects in the wind, and that's exactly what it does. You know, it's like a sieve, and it's sieving the insects. So these are the sort of things I'm trying to aim for, something which is new, and yet when you read it, you recognize it instantly and say that's absolutely correct. It's very hard work. That's why there are hardly any descriptions in there. You know, the sky is blue, that's it. Yes.
At this point, I'd like to open it up for a bit to audience questions. Does anybody have anything that they'd like to ask? Excellent.
Hi, Twan. You know, a few years ago at the Georgetown Literary Festival, there was an evening with Twan at the Blue Mansion. I happened to be hosting it, so at that time, there were some questions that were posed to you about what your next novel is going to be about. And you're very reluctant to say how close you were to finishing it and also what it was about, but you did mention Sun Yat-sen at that point. However, you did not mention Somerset Maugham at all. So I wondered whether, because since then, it's been quite a while before this book finally got published, did you actually have a rethink? Did you go back, or did something happen in the writing that kind of delayed this whole? I know the movie got in the way and things like that, but was it Sun Yat-sen first that sowed the seeds for this novel, or was it Somerset Maugham?
I think one of the reasons I didn't mention Somerset Maugham that evening was because you didn't get me drunk enough to
That's
just had enough to drink to be slightly non-discretionary, but the idea for both of them had been there at the same time. You see, the thing is, I never want to tell people what I'm working on because I've seen it firsthand that ideas get hijacked by other people. And one of the reasons I'm reluctant also is ideas don't come easily to me. That's why you don't see me writing short stories, because whatever ideas I have, I feel that I would be frittering the ideas away if I just threw it on a short story. So I would rather hoard my ideas and somehow grow them into novels or use them in other ways. Yeah, so the short answer to your question is they were at the same time happening. Okay. So that's the reason why it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, please feel free to ask. I'm at your mercy today, so
maybe lots of people have asked you this question already, but I'm especially interested because I spent a lot of time living in Japan. I'm just wondering why you have so much fascination for like Japanese culture in your last two books, and it seems like I haven't read your third book yet, but it seems like that's not, you don't have that. So I'm just wondering why you had so much interest in the first two books, when you show that in the first book, and are you over that and you're ready to move on to other things?
let's wait for the flight announcement to finish with the flight announcement. That's okay.
We will persevere.
Okay, so my interest in Japan was, the question is why am I so fascinated with Japan and the culture enough to write two books about it? The main reason was I started learning Japanese martial art, and that fascinated me to discover more about it. And I think the country of Japan is fascinating as well because it's such a harmonious blend of the ultra future and the ultra past as well, and they've somehow achieved a balance there, which is not incongruous or jarring. So I find that this merging, they're so modern and yet they've retained so much of their history and past and their old customs. And I think it can be a good lesson for us here as well in Malaysia as well, to adopt that, to not discard our heritage in this race to be modern and to become almost anonymous in this race to be modern, because we lose so much when we do that. With this book, no, there's nothing Japanese in there, except maybe the poem, and that's it there.
Before we pass it over, I just have one question and then we'll get to you. So, Twan, you mentioned ideas don't come easy. And so we've been talking a bit about the writing process, right? But I wanted to talk actually about the ideation process. So, how do ideas get hooked in your head? Do you take a while to develop? How do you pursue the ones that you think are workable?
Something will occur to me, and if it's the idea that I feel has stamina, because you really need ideas that will last 10 years. And you never know until you start thinking more about it. So when something happens to me, when I think of something, I don't discard it straight away as saying it's not workable. I would just try and think, okay, if I want to write about Somerset Maugham and the letter, how do I approach that? So that starts gnawing away at me. And I start reading up about the subject matter to see how I can approach it and to see whether it's too big a project and I can't take it on. So it starts very slowly. I don't plan, I don't plot everything because I can't. I don't know what's going to happen in this book. So it's really very, very slow, and that's why it's taken so long. Aside from the fact that I'm lazy as well, so I don't want to write. I've got to be out shopping mall in a bookshop, sitting in front of the computer.
Thank you so much for doing this. I contacted Jalil and
I think I just switch it on.
is it okay? Is it on? Alright. Okay. Up until this point, looking back on your journey writing this book, I know it must have been a painful journey. So if you were to describe that journey in one word, what would it be, and could you elaborate?
Well, you've already used the word. It's called painful. It was incredibly painful because first of all, it wasn't working. Everything wasn't working. Everything was in a mess. I couldn't get the story to come together, and I kept pushing and pushing because I spent so much time researching. I felt it would be a waste to abandon, and I had no other ideas anyway for the next book. So I kept pushing at it, and finally, when I finished the first draft, I let one of my friends read it, and he said it was one of the worst things he'd ever read. He said it was so boring and so confusing. He said, he said, you can't publish this. You really can't. You have to start on something else. Oh, that's a friend. No, that's a friend. No, an enemy would say, "Oh, it's great. You should publish this now," and then you watch me flop in public. So you always need a friend like that who will be brutally frank. I don't like it, because I hate it. You want praise. You want him to say, "Wow, this is such a masterpiece." No. I said, "No, this is awful." So I started rewriting. It still wouldn't work. And then when I finished the rewrite, I gave to the same friend again, and he said, "I don't want to read it." So, I don't want to go through that again. Fine. I sent it to my agent and her reader there, and again, you want your agent to come back the next day and say, "Oh, I spent the whole night reading. I didn't sleep at all." No, she took 2 weeks before she emailed me back again. And it was very hard not to email her every day. I said, so. When she finally emailed me and I said, we have to have a conference call, and I said, and I wasn't looking towards the call at all. So we had a call, and she also said, you can't, this doesn't work. And I said, so how? And she said, well, you can't. So eventually we said, let's get a pair of fresh eyes in, because by that point I had lost all objectivity already. I didn't know whether it's good or bad, but people seemed to think it was bad, so I had to listen. We got the editor from Canongate, Francis Bickmore, to come in and to read. I was reluctant at first because at that stage I wasn't signed to Canongate at all. So I didn't feel that it was right to impose it on him. But I was desperate, so I said, okay, let's get Francis to read it. Francis didn't take 2 weeks at all to come back. He took 3. So, so that was even worse. And he also said, "Oh, can I call you instead of emailing?" So I said, okay. And he called, and he said, we want to buy this book. I was taken aback. So being a very good Asian, you give them a face-saving way to change their minds. So I said, "Are you sure? Because you don't have to." "Are you sure? Really? You sure?" Yeah. So we started working on that, and he's a very good editor. He said that the book works fine, but you just need to clarify certain things. You need to put chapter headings, the date, the time, who's narrating it, to clear any confusion. So reluctantly I did that because I never liked chapter headings. because my readers are all very intelligent, so I know that they will know as they read where the scene's set and in which time period. No, you're all very intelligent, so I trust you all. But he said, no, you see, he's more cynical than I am. So we did that, and I was surprised at what a difference to the manuscript it made. Suddenly, it started to make sense. He asked me to change the location of a few scenes, the chapters, clarify certain things, and I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. I said, oh, there's actually hope that this is not going to flop. Also in the writing process, because I got annoyed with him a few times over his direction, so I told myself, okay, I'm going to show you what I can do when you push me. So I really forced myself to up my game. There are a few new scenes in there which weren't there when he started working with me. And I gave these scenes to him, and after he was quite impressed. He said, oh. So I said, oh, yeah, and I said, yeah. Yes, let's see. So the question, it was very difficult, but I think it's been worth it in the end. For some strange reason, I say that today. And to be honest, when I started, I didn't think that the reception would be the way it's been getting very good reviews. So huge relief as well when the first review started coming in the UK, because I was again dreading it when I read it, and then suddenly it seems that there's a consensus that it's not a stinker or a flop. So that's a huge relief.
As a friend read it.
As my friend read it. As my friend. Oh, I made sure to give him a free copy. Every good review that I received, I sent them to my agent and the reader and to all the. Nothing. I said nothing. I just said, here's a new review. But in my heart, I was going na 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 na. Yeah.
Well, actually, I was just going to ask you, Twan. Is there a aim or a sort of an impulse to stretch yourself from project to project? For instance, might we at some point see you not doing historical fiction?
Well, the aim has always been to improve as a writer with every book. So I'm very conscious of that this is a lifelong career, and you really have to become better and better with time and with experience, because otherwise what's the point? You're going to stagnate at the same level. So the push is there by self to improve all the time. As to your question whether it's going to be historical fiction all the time, I don't know. And strangely, I don't see myself as a historical fiction writer. When I'm writing it, all these stories, they feel very current and very present, because the themes are still relevant today. The injustice that a lot of women face, the injustice that a lot of minorities face, the isms, all the isms, it's still here. When I finished this book, writing this book, I was quite surprised at how feminist the book turned out to be. It's a very, very feminist novel, and it's also very, very anti-marriage as well. It was surprising when I read it.
That's actually a question I wanted to put to you, because this book, as you rightly point out, has themes of female independence, there's betrayal, there is anti-marriage, as you rightly point out. So how do you write about themes that are evergreen, but that also have evolved in modern times? So in other words, your lens when writing about these issues, is it of the time or is it of now?
Well, to start with, I don't have any lenses when I write. I don't set out intentionally to say, oh, I'm going to talk about colonialism or racism or this other isms. It's basically the characters that I'm more concerned with, to make them believable and that you engage with them. And when you're writing about a female character set 100 years ago, it's inevitable that you're going to rub against all the constrictions that they face and the injustices that any character would face as well. So it's very natural to because in your plotting as well, you come up against these walls that your characters face. I couldn't have Leslie walking about Georgetown alone on her own for most of the time or at night, because a white woman of that time would not be allowed to. So that's why one of the scenes in there, when she goes to see Sun Yat-sen's HQ for the first time, she had to go with her brother. That's all these things you have to be aware of. When Leslie wanted to go to Kuala Lumpur on her own and stay in a hotel on her own, her husband says, "You can't do that, you're a married woman. What would people say if they saw you checking into a hotel on your own?" And that's why when she does check into the hotel and she signs the register as well, she feels that she's transgressing and breaking all the rules. So these are the things that are all present there when you write about something like this. And it's what I'm also interested in is not of the moment, but I'm not interested in writing what is timely, because what is timely or fashionable will be out of fashion within 6 months. I'm more interested in writing what is timeless. And unfortunately, issues like injustice, discrimination, are unfortunately timeless. I don't see things changing in the next 100 years. There will